Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. The Biden administration has completed its North Korea policy review, making it clear that the main goal remains to be the complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. However, details about what kind of concrete measures the U.S. will take have yet to be disclosed. Meanwhile, in London, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken shared the result of the North Korea policy review with other G7 countries, signaling the start of multilateral policy towards North Korea. Today, we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Nicholas Eberstadt. Dr. Eberstadt holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a founding member of the U.S. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. Scott Snyder also joins me today. Mr. Snyder is director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's authored numerous books on the Korean Peninsula, with the latest being South Korea at the Crossroads. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First, Dr. Eberstadt, what did you find most distinctive about the announcement of the North Korean policy review?
The most distinctive part of it was the very broad generalities of the announcement by spokesperson Psaki. We learned that it was going to be a sort of a moderate policy that would involve engagement, but also continuation of practical measures. I suppose what we really heard was an implicit announcement that we were going back to a more familiar U.S. approach towards North Korea policy, which was at the same time going to attempt to avoid some of the identified mistakes of the past.
Mr. Snyder?
Well, I agree with Nick that the announcement was quite general and maybe a little bit frustrating for analysts because we really want to know the judgments and the logic behind the approach, but all we really got was the outline and the conclusions.
Mr. Snyder, when we look back at the way how the Biden administration announced, first there was a news report, and then later on the White House press secretary made an announcement at a press gaggle on a plane. What do you think was the calculation behind this?
Well, I'm sure they have their own strategy. What was really more interesting to me, as Nick has suggested, is that the way they decided to frame the policy review results. I mean, it was a classic bureaucratic strategy, I think, of either stay the course or pursue a radically different approach and then take the middle option. And I think that that is very interesting that they framed it that way. I think that the other thing about it maybe is that it looks like they are really going for action as the core principle, because frankly, that's the bottom line for the U.S. in dealing with North Korea. But of course, the challenge is that the North Koreans have walked away from action.
And Dr. Eberstadt?
Well, the new normal in Washington is that whatever you do today is the way it's supposed to go. I think that maybe the idea of indicating that there was a process rather than a personalistic decision or an impulsive decision was meant to be reassuring to allies. The vagueness that Scott refers to, of course, frustrates all of us analysts who'd like to see a little bit more substance. But we also have to remember that there's been an unhappy learning process in U.S.-North Korea policy over the last 30 years. And many of the participants in this policy review have been on the unhappy end of the learning curve as North Korea has gradually become a more significant and more menacing nuclear presence. So I don't think we should be surprised that we didn't hear more about the mistakes that current members of the team made in previous administrations.
Dr. Eberstadt, these senior officials, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki or National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Secretary of State Antony Blinken, they all used some common phrases when they were explaining about this North Korean policy review. They said the U.S. policy calls for a calibrated, practical policy towards North Korea. How would you interpret this?
I think this is suggesting an actions for actions approach, almost a sort of a horse trading approach. When one tries to imagine what there is to trade, the scope is remarkably limited at the moment. I can imagine a couple of things myself, but it's a pretty small field. One other thing I would mention, which spokesperson Psaki said, and Secretary Blinken and NSA Sullivan have mentioned at other times, is this language problem with whether we're actually for denuclearization of North Korea or denuclearization of the North Korean peninsula. This may sound like the ultimate in splitting hairs, but there is a very important underlying argument about this, in part because the North Korean government insists on the latter language, denuclearizing the peninsula. And the South Korean government at the moment is also insisting upon that language.
Mr. Snyder, was the Biden administration trying to keep the language concise yet coherent?
Well, we'll have to see how that develops. But what I'm really struck by overall, by what we've heard so far, is that this appears to be a policy less focused on dealing with North Korea and more focused on alliance management.
Yes.
Yes. And maybe even kind of compartmentalizing the North Korea issue as a way of clearing the decks in order to focus on the administration's true focus, which is the competition with China.
Mm-hmm. I want to just follow up on what Mr. Snyder said earlier. Dr. Eberstadt, from the statement, can we get the hint that this North Korean policy is part of the overall China policy?
It's not said there. It's not said there. It goes unsaid. But I think if one looks at the administration's overall actions, if we look at the time and the emphasis that members of the team are placing in international diplomacy and security policy, we see that China is the overarching question, and the competition with China has been indicated as the major priority for the administration.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I think you go back to the 2+2 trip with Blinken and Austin going to Japan and South Korea, and those two statements and the differences between those two statements alongside the framing of the engagement with China around the Quad Summit. And it leaves a distinct impression that North Korea is an issue to be managed while China is the strategic focus of the policy.
What was also notable about the announcement was that the Biden administration made it clear that the new U.S. policy on North Korea will neither be a grand bargain nor strategic patience. So, Mr. Snyder, does this mean the Biden team's North Korea policy will be somewhere in the middle?
Well, it looks like it will be somewhere in the middle. I think that the other notable aspect of the announcement was the decision to delay the appointment of a special representative for North Korea. I find it fascinating that South Korean Foreign Minister Chung Wi-young has already publicly pushed back on that. But I think that it gives further evidence that the administration doesn't want to devote resources prematurely to engagement with North Korea at a time when all of the signals coming from North Korea are really adverse to the possibility of negotiations.
Right. Dr. Eberstadt, what's your thought on this?
If the administration could continue the policy review for another few years, I think they would be very happy to do so, but exigence does not permit that. Clearly, clearly China and China policy is the top priority for the administration, and they also have been unambiguous that they wish to address the China question through multilateral diplomacy, alliance policy, coalition building, and the rest. Our South Korean allies are quite insistent that we focus upon the DPRK question more immediately than perhaps our diplomatists would wish, which is, I would make a distinction between our diplomatists and our intelligence community. Our threat assessment and our diplomacy are somewhat separate, I think, or have somewhat different emphases here.
Dr. Eberstadt, Secretary Blinken said the U.S. has a very clear policy that centers on diplomacy. Does this mean they're going to put emphasis more on talks rather than on pressure?
Well, I think it's not surprising that the chief American diplomat would say that the policy is centered on diplomacy. It almost comes as part of your job description.
Very much on Russia's
What
actions.
we'd have to ask about is exactly what sorts of international interactions we're talking about. Are we talking about interactions with the DPRK? Are we talking about firming up alliance cohesion? There's plenty of room for that. Developing other international coalitions, such as was done at the G7 meeting. There's certainly plenty of room for diplomacy on the North Korean question. A more difficult question is how much room for diplomacy there is in horse trading with Pyongyang itself.
Mr. Snyder, how should we understand the word diplomacy?
Well, I agree with the way that Nick laid it out. There's many dimensions here, but I just want to emphasize that in my own view, this is actually a smart approach and the right approach to keep the hand outstretched with North Korea, because it highlights North Korea's inability to respond. And I think that in particular, in tandem with the efforts to increase international alignment around North Korea issues, denuclearization and human rights in the G7 statement, that has the effect of putting pressure on North Korea and highlighting where North Korea is out of step with the international community, rather than allowing North Korea to define it strictly as a bilateral issue between the U.S. and North Korea.
So did you see the G7 meeting as part of the U.S. move towards a multilateral diplomacy with North Korea?
Well, it's definitely stepped up compared to what we saw in the Trump administration. We'll have to see how it plays out. I thought it was interesting that in the G7 summit, actually human rights was dealt with before denuclearization in that summit. But I definitely feel that the administration is taking an approach that is as much about North Korea as with North Korea.
Dr. Eberstadt, do you see it as the U.S. leaning towards the multilateral actors in dealing with North Korea rather than going one-on-one?
Well, they're trying to use multilateral diplomacy, if you want to call the G7 a multilateral institution, and definitely. I'm not sure I agree 100% with Scott, although our general perspective is very similar. If we take a look at the North Korean negotiating playbook over the last 30 years, which has been very successful against the U.S. and the international community, of course, I would wonder whether the North Korean government might be more inclined to do some horse trading about a pause in the nuclear program now than in the past. And the reason I speculate about this, and this is only speculation, is that the North Korean economy seems to be in such absolutely dire straits at the moment, as admitted by Kim Jong-un, among others. If the North Korean defense economy at the moment is not capable of moving forward, that would be really a wonderful time to get some benefits for a pause, if you see what I mean. And that's only speculation, but it would be interesting to see where things develop over the coming year.
Dr. Eberstadt, the Secretary Blinken said it is now up to North Korea to decide whether it'll engage in diplomacy with the U.S. But according to the Washington Post, North Korea's Kim Jong-un regime did not respond to the second attempt by the Biden administration to convey the results of this now completed review. Why do you think that is the case now?
I'd say that's not surprising on two counts. It's not surprising because it's always in North Korea's court. North Korea always decides what the agenda is. It always decides when we'll talk. It always decides when the negotiations are over. North Korea always has the whip hand in negotiations with the international community. So in general, that's not surprising. More particularly, the North Korean playbook, and we've seen this for 30 years, is always to brush off the first entreaties or the first inquiries from the U.S., from South Korea, from others in the international community. Its terms of trade and the bargaining that it undertakes are always higher if it doesn't seem too eager, even if North Korea is in the midst of an economic calamity, as it may be today.
Mr. Snyder, do you think North Korea is waiting for more details to come out from the U.S. side?
Not necessarily. I mean, on the one hand, North Korea has put forward an approach in which it's, I think, not averse to negotiations. It just doesn't want to negotiate about denuclearization. Whereas the Biden administration has now made it clear that the focus on denuclearization for the U.S. government is going to continue. And so from that perspective, North Korea doesn't necessarily have much incentive to come to talks. And in fact, it highlights the big kind of outstanding issue that we have to wait to see whether the review addresses adequately. And that is that North Korea continues to progress on its nuclear development path unchecked. And then the debate becomes whether or not diplomacy or whether we have other means by which to address that fundamental challenge, which that over time increasingly is clearly making the problem worse.
Then what do you expect from North Korea now? When and how will they react?
I've actually been anticipating protracted stalemate for this relationship. Possibly there could be some kind of effort to reshape the table through provocation. It's also possible that the North Koreans, if the situation is really dire internally, could resort to trying to get paid for participation, as we saw in the 1990s. But I think that we have to wait and see.
Dr. Eberstadt.
The overall international situation is quite unfavorable for North Korea from a financial and economic standpoint, although there has been talk about the limited efficacy of the sanctions. I think the long-term degradation of the North Korean economy is quite clear. Kim Jong-un's mention of the phrase "arduous march" pricked up the ears of all North Korea watchers, because we know what happened when there was an arduous march in the 1990s, and when there was an arduous march for Kim Il-sung back in the 1930s. It was a near-death situation for the regime. So, as Scott says, we've got a sort of a sitzkrieg at the moment. We've got a sort of a waiting game. And the question will be how the North Korean government tries to change the shape of
being with us today.
Thank you very much.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.